What if every civilization falls, not by conquest, but by collapse from within? From Ibn Khaldun to Marx, great thinkers have observed that civilizations often carry the seeds of their own decline. So where are we now? I'm Soraya Salam, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
The supposition has been that we will always be able to innovate our way out of problems as long as there are market incentives to do so.
Our whole conversation about collapse presumes a monotheistic understanding of history.
Maybe one of the benefits of loss of complexity is reconnection to truth with a capital T.
Diversity is an asset, right? It is not a burden. It's not going to collapse societies. It's going to make us resilient.
Our debate today, are civilizations destined to fail? Joining me today, anthropologist Joseph Tainter, who is a professor at Utah State University. Faisal Devji, historian and professor at the University of Oxford. Jonathan Brown, professor of Islamic civilization at Georgetown University. And digital anthropologist Payal Arora, who is a professor at Utrecht University. Thank you all for being here. You bring really different perspectives, so I'm looking forward to a passionate discussion. But first, I just want to get the lay of the land a bit. Yes or no, are we on the verge of collapse? Faisal?
I wouldn't use the word collapse. Perhaps a tipping point in some respects, like climate change, and a kind of dissolution in some other respects, like the international order, which is disappearing before our very eyes. But I wouldn't subscribe to any notions of a rapid and absolute collapse where things just fall apart.
Joseph, you were sounding the alarm bells 36 years ago with your book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. So right now, how would you describe this moment?
I define a collapse as the rapid simplification of a society. The political system simplifies, the economy simplifies, political territorial units break up into smaller units. I focus in my work on the evolution of what I call complexity in societies, addressing the broader question of why did human societies ever grow more complex? Complexity in any living system, by which I mean not just humans, but any kind of animals, always has a metabolic cost. For us, the cost in the past was paid largely in human labor, subsidized by the environment. And for societies to increase in complexity in the past, from simple hunter-gatherers to great empires, it meant that people had to work harder. So you ask the question, why would people undertake to do this? And so that has been the basis of my work, focusing on the evolution of complexity. And when does complexity fail? When do societies break apart? Mm-hmm. I would say that any complex society could collapse. I don't predict that any is specifically going to at any time in the near future, but there are vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jonathan?
I think it depends how you define collapse. And kind of Last of Us, Mad Max collapse? No, I don't think we're on the verge of that. But I think a lot of what we think of as being civilization is actually sort of like kind of post-Cold War, global Western, kind of liberal democratic order. I think that seems to be either at a tipping point or definitely a point of crisis, if not collapse.
Mm-hmm. Really quickly, Payal, are we on the verge?
Absolutely not. And in fact, I would say, we need to purge the word collapse from our imaginary, because it's basically not a very useful way in which we can construct our approaches. Because if you do that, then you have to subscribe to the rise and fall of civilizations, which means you're really going into the whole Western-centric, loophole of linearity and of, binaries. And in fact, I would even push for an argument that we are in a renaissance in the making because it is fueled by the youth momentum, technological innovations, which are creating enormous amounts of hope on the ground at a granular level, despite the larger geopolitics that are driving a lot of pessimism bias, particularly in the West.
Technological innovation, but you argue that there's a cost to that, isn't there?
Beginning in the 1990s, I began orienting my work more toward what's called sustainability. And in thinking about the elements of sustainability and what various students of sustainability focus on, I have decided that there are two elements that underpin the sustainability of any society, and they are energy and innovation. There are what are called technological optimists in some schools of economics who believe that resources don't matter, that there will always be incentives to innovate as long as we have markets and the price mechanism and governments don't get in the way, that we will always be able to invent our way out of problems, that there will always be incentives to invent our way out of problems. If that's not the case, then we have to reconsider the future we are envisioning.
Faisal, what are the biggest threats we face today?
As we all know, technology is a double-edged thing because in it resides hopes for successfully alleviating problems and overcoming them altogether. But this very instrument of overcoming is also the site of sort of massive fantasies of collapse and fear. So technology as a form of social control, of mind control, of individual control. And I think it's the ambiguity of perceptions around any particular, in this case technology, but any particular instrument of increasing or decreasing, let's say, civilization that we have to attend to. I'm not suggesting that one side of the debate is correct and the other side is incorrect. Both may be correct in some ways and both incorrect in others. So this is not quite an answer to your question, but a way of suggesting that the malign or negative characteristics of any event or any phenomenon or movement is something that we should look upon both in terms of an opportunity as much as a risk.
Faisal's correct, Jonathan, in saying that we have been focusing a bit on technology right now, but you're looking at it from a very different perspective.
Okay, so when you're talking about energy in a system, so complexity requires energy and innovation. So energy at a system-wide level basically means human labor, and which is like calories. I mean, pre-modern societies, calories, lamp oil, animal labor, which then comes from solar energy that's gone into grass and things like that, right? And wood that we burn. And modern societies have basically massively enhanced their ability to draw on solar energy by using millions of years old animal and plant remains, right? But this has, one, it appears to be exhaustible. It seems to be exhaustible. And two, it has horrendous impact on our environment, which threatens the sustainability of our society, not just because we might run out of energy, but because our Earth will become increasingly less habitable. So how can you, especially since so much technology seems to require an enormous amount of energy, like ChatGPT, which my wife's always using for getting recipes and stuff like that. But how can we do that without some new form of energy that doesn't draw on solar energy that's stored in fossil fuels?
You know, I mean, these kinds of questions mirror the kind of conversations we were having for decades ago, say with the population bomb theory, right? Like, oh my God, at the rate at which the world is growing, we are going to reach a collapse. It's the same with, every new technology. Like, we were driven by horse carriages at one point, and we were thinking, how can we scale this? And look at the pollution that it's going to create. And we don't have the answers, but what we do have is a history that tells us when there is a problem that is aggregating in a particular area to a tipping point, it's not resolving that problem by staying there. It's by using our imagination, our ingenuity to fuel us towards a different kind of trajectory where we can actually make things work for us, right?
Historically speaking, should we be looking at this as a natural part of the cycle of human history? Are we all destined to collapse and decline at some point only to rise again, Joseph?
I don't use terms like rise. I like to keep the terminology that I use as neutral as possible. If you're asking, after a collapse, would complex societies emerge again? Yes, there's every likelihood that would be the case. I'm not going to predict any specific direction or outcome or nature of such societies. And I don't predict that the way we live today is doomed or that today's complex societies will collapse. I do see vulnerabilities, including energy, including possibly economic and political frustration if we were to reach, let's say, some kind of economic plateau, which some people are arguing we have in fact reached and surpassed. That it's been pointed out, at least in the United States, that incomes have not grown since the 1970s, and this creates political discontent. And I mean, we see it in recent elections in my country. And discontent can bring about conflict and make societies increasingly vulnerable to rapid changes. Again, collapses are possible. I have to say that in recent years, I've become increasingly worried about globalization. The COVID showed us how global supply chains can be disrupted. And in a way I considered it a shot across the bow, an early warning with fairly minor disruptions, but the globalization is so embedded now in how people in the industrialized countries at least live that if there were ever a widespread massive disruption in transoceanic trade, it could bring on a collapse.
And Faisal, talk to me a bit about the shift in the global world order as you see it today. Are we seeing a shift of the Western-led order?
Yes, I think certainly since the end of the Cold War. If you look at the international order as we have inherited it, as we also all know, was put into place after the Second World War in the context of the beginning of the Cold War. And what that meant was that the United Nations system and everything that went along with it, including the Bretton Woods institutions, were meant to bring together enemies. In this case, the United States and its allies, vassals, etc., satellites, and the Soviet Union and its allies, vassals, and satellites. And it allowed them to talk to each other despite disagreeing on many things. With the end of the Cold War, the enemy suddenly ceased to exist. We have had to look for new enemies, but also more important than finding new enemies is the fact that a world or an international order without an enemy turns out to be one in which conversations, negotiations, and compromises can be thrown out of the window. So with the end of the Cold War, you have a situation in which the so-called unipolar order, which lasted, say, about a decade, until 9/11, I would argue, meant that the United Nations and all it stood for were no longer essential. Military and other actions were taken outside its purview. And this continues to be the case. And so you have a steady, if not rapid, decline of the international order through its most important institutions. But at the very moment where the international order seems to be falling apart, you therefore see the building blocks potentially of a new one. And the building block that I'm particularly fascinated by is the return of neutrality to international politics. And what neutrality does is it allows for a limitation of conflict, so it doesn't become a global conflict, and it also allows for mediation.
Payal?
I really enjoy this conversation because we come from so many different disciplines, and in the technology world, the term neutrality has been undergoing quite a backlash because it's been accused of embedding bias into systems and denying that there's bias in data sets, for example, that feed into the training of AI, for example, which not just reproduces injustice, but amplifies it, right? So this idea is, let's get back to a sort of reflexive neutrality. In the end is, what do we have in common? Like, don't we have values for sustainability? Yes, we all care about the fate of the planet is going to impact us all. Don't we care about diversity is an asset, right? It is not a burden. It's not going to collapse societies. It's going to make us resilient. We see this in data sets. So in a way, actually, there's this building up, because particularly the extremity of the conversation that's happening right now, driven by the US politic, is pushing us together saying, hang on, let's actually defend diversity as an asset, defend our geopolitics, and even materialize some of these old school, it reminds me of like BRICS, right? Which was really a term that was created by Wall Street to get people to invest in the developing countries because that seemed very depressing. And now it's actually become a thing, which is actually bringing the many global South actors together to come up with new reforms for data regulation, data value, as well as the way in which we use energy. And so there's a sort of, let's think together, because majority of the world can't afford to consume the way the US consumes. Otherwise, we will actually have a problem.
So a lot of the things that we think of as like kind of the end of history, post, sort of late 20th century, early 21st century, techno-utopia, liberal democracy, this was all created in the United States post-Cold War by government, defense spending, to research institutions, to think tanks, that created things like the internet and all these like utopian hippies who are actually getting this stuff funded by the Defense Department and things like that. This whole like military Keynesian system was driven by the Cold War, right? This looming enemy that all, quote unquote, all Americans agreed on, all Westerners agreed there was this enemy in the form of Soviet-like communism. And that's what a lot of people argue held the American political system together. It's what allowed sort of Democrats and Republicans to be bipartisan, even when they disagreed about stuff. Politics stops at the ocean's edge and things like that. And that there are some scholars who argue today that it's the end of the Cold War, sort of you see the beginning of the fraying and then disassembling of the system. So does the enemy allow you to build complexity? And does its loss mean inevitable simplification or like fragmentation within the community?
I mean, your example of World War II and after World War II shows how the defeat of enemies ultimately led to expansion of international institutions and to a larger role for the United States in the rest of the world. I mean, this is certainly an increase in complexity. It's one that I think most of us around this table would regard as primarily beneficial to at least the industrialized countries, the wealthier countries, and we like to think for the entire world. But they were costly. They're not free. None of this is free. We have to pay for all of these things. And we see today in politics in the United States how there is some reaction against those costs, or at least a feeling among some politicians that perhaps other parts of the world are freeloading on the United States, letting us undertake the burden and the cost and so forth. I don't agree with that myself, but that is a feeling that some Americans have, or at least some American politicians have. So what we see in American politics today is in some ways a reaction to the expansion of the United States throughout the world after the end of World War II.
Jonathan, is there something this discussion is missing so far when we're talking about the concept of progress, of avoiding collapse in economic terms only, political terms only, technological terms only?
Yeah, but that's usually missing from any of these kind of discussions, which is sort of like the metaphysical element of the human beings as more than just material beings. I think that what I find interesting about this discourse, and this is, these are kind of tropes. They may or may not be always be accurate, but I mean, I think there's an idea of sort of, as people become more technologically sophisticated, richer, that you get kind of disconnection of more atomization in society. People move into cities. They don't visit their cousins all the time, and they sort of become disconnected from nature, disconnected from one another. They become sort of decadent in the search for pleasure and personal fulfillment. You add to that kind of like consumer capitalism, and then you're taught, or you're instructed by the culture around you that you'll gain fulfillment by consuming and by getting the newest iPhone or whatever, the newest car. And that, all of this is sort of, leads to human alienation, not just from one another, not just from nature, but also from like the fact that we have a soul, that a lot of, most human beings throughout history suppose that there was some existence beyond this earth, this material realm, and that humans had some kind of duty to connect themselves to that. And that would actually give them fulfillment. So the idea of the kind of the alienation caused by modernity and the West and urbanization, this is kind of a century and a half old idea. But I think what's interesting about, even if you talk about a moderate loss of moderate simplification, if you talk about people moving, let's say, from living in a city to living in the suburbs, and then they get, start growing. Like one of my neighbors is like started to keep bees, and people have their little vegetable gardens. So, you wonder, as people sort of become worried about what happens if there's another COVID epidemic or something like that, or they're not working so hard anymore. They did, maybe they lost their job or something like that. So as you can imagine kind of a gradual descent into a less economic plenty, less expectations of progress and material gain, that there would be this like increased connection with family, reconnection with nature, reconnection with the divine. So I think that's like an interesting, and you can see this in a lot of the, admittedly, sometimes, mostly very negative, very vitriolic discourse around, Christian civilization is collapsing, or, we need to get back. So the ethnic national identity of, these weird foreigners are coming into these European countries and we need to get back to some like European Christian identity. But apart from the kind of xenophobia and the fear there's also this idea of reconnecting to tradition in its positive sense of being like connection to one another, connection to nature, connection to the divine, connection to truth. So there's this idea of maybe one of the benefits of loss of complexity is reconnection to like truth with a capital T. But I don't know. Some people think this is hooey, so I don't know.
I'd like to know what the table thinks. I mean, shared values, shared concepts of truth, connection to the transcendent. Does that matter for the preservation of a civilization? To be connected to something greater than yourself?
I think firstly, we shouldn't put some of the most pressing issues we have at the table, which is like, say, the climate crisis, contingent on shared values. It's not going to happen. Okay, because of the diversity of populations, societies, cultures, we have to come to an understanding. So the question is that how can we operate on very important issues that we face today, despite the fact that as a humanity, we will never, and we never have, we never will, have necessarily shared values across board. And that is okay as long as we have certain kinds of principles that are governing, where we prioritize, say, the fate of our planet or the value of, of our relationships. And what's interesting to me is in the world of technology now, there's a conversation of looking at, say, indigenous values and indigenous systems and the way they approach sharing of value. Because right now, AI is creating a lot of anxieties about, who are we as a humanity? Because if AI can create, then what makes us special as human, and who owns it? Is it AI or me? Is it, who should do the job? Am I being replaced? So you're positioned against versus thinking in terms of shared value in a different sense, or how do you redistribute value between technology companies and the extraordinary power they right now hold. I think that sort of massaging that into worlds that normally don't, listen to these kinds of circles, to me is promising.
But Faisal, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, sometimes the metaphysical or the theological stares us in the face and we don't even see it. So, for instance, our whole conversation about collapse presumes a monotheistic understanding of history. You begin and then you end, and there's an apocalypse. And these apocalyptic scenarios, whether it's through climate change, it used to be during the Cold War, nuclear war. It's the same apocalypse. It's just changed garb. And what's interesting about both those visions of apocalypse is that they bring the theological element back to modern life for the first time in a couple of centuries. That is to say, before the nuclear bomb, you couldn't really think about the end of the world apart from in a purely theological sense. With the atom bomb and now with climate change, suddenly it's become possible to take a traditionally theological vision of apocalypse and make it scientific and make it part of. But if you are from a tradition like Hinduism, it's not linear, it's cyclical. You have cycles, and there's a dissolution, pralaya, after each cycle, and then it rebuilds, and there's birth and rebirth. So it's not a linear idea. So, here you have at least two schematically drawn metaphysical understandings of temporality or of history. One which is apocalyptic, the other which has dissolution, but it's not linear, it's cyclical.
But do you find an issue with the apocalyptic narrative from a scientific perspective being stripped of that kind of sacred wisdom, that meaning? Do you find an issue with that?
I think that the sacredness exists, but it exists in the fear and the rapture. This word rapture, which is also very popular among certain American evangelicals, where you're raptured away or raptured up, and the world ends and you have rapture, So even in these apparently modern forms of apocalyptic thinking, you have the presence of the metaphysical, let us even say the sacred, or a way of experiencing the sacred through destruction. It's a worrying way of experiencing the sacred, but destruction has always been part of the understanding of the sacred.
I mean, I think that's certainly one view, and I think certain people have that view and had that view during the Cold War. But I think in Western tradition, you also have the kind of decline and fall of Rome template, right? Where it's like a periodic template, right? Where you have decline, recovery, rebirth, decline. So there's sort of like different Romes, and there's the new Rome and then the new Rome and things like that. So, and how that happens has been discussed by, sociologists like Ibn Khaldun or Edward Gibbon and endless people since then, right? Which is the idea of, asabiya, which Ibn Khaldun talks about, or like group solidarity. There's society, a group of people have a kind of commitment to some shared identity or belief or project, something that ties them together and motivates them, that enables them to like create, defeat other people, gain resources, create structures, and that basically then you get the old joke about the first generation immigrant is like the businessman, then second generation is like the really successful businessman, third generation is like the artist who sits at home and watches Netflix or something like that. So you get this like decline into decadence and a dissipation of that group solidarity. So the question is like, what gives you that group solidarity? And then there's, some people would say religion. So Islam, Ibn Khaldun talked about Islam being like the ultimate group solidarity. People would talk about, like American kind of patriotism after World War II, or kind of this notion of liberal democracy or freedom or fighting against the godless communists or things like that. So I think that when you talk about collapse, I think some people could argue that there's like there's a dissipation of whatever the crucial asabiya was in that dispensation of complex society.
But beyond religious identity, Payal, Joseph, I'm just wondering if you have an opinion on specifically this perceived breakdown of community, whether it's tied to religious institutions or elsewhere. I mean, we're talking about the digital space, technology, and kind of the great paradox of our time is social media. Seems there's something going on here, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. Like, in fact, there's a lot of anxiety around technologies. And if you listen closely to these conversations, it's all about how do I contain these technologies? How do I control them? How do I, position them in a way which I can then, preserve my society, my values. And, so it's interesting because I'm a digital anthropologist, which basically means I study how young people make sense and use digital tools in their everyday lives. And I've been focusing on young people for the last 2 decades, particularly in the global south, and marginalized settings, like from refugees in Brazil to slums in India to townships in South Africa. And so while I'm in the West, I live in the Netherlands, and I tend to also go down that, rabbit hole sometimes thinking, oh my God, this is really getting depressing. But my data is speaking otherwise. If anyone who's like traveled to India, or actually even here, you speak to young people, they're so extraordinarily excited, and doesn't mean that they don't see the problems with technology. Yes, it can create isolation, bullying, but on the contrary, you have to understand that majority of young people in these societies live in conservative settings with very strong socio-cultural norms, and they don't get to be. I come from India. I know growing up, it was really tough to be a woman. And when we talk about surveillance, we're not thinking so much about government surveillance. We're thinking about interpersonal surveillance, my aunts and my uncles and my my cousins. And I'm like, oh my God, stop. Like, how did you see what she wore, how she behaved, what she said, and the gossip circles. And, it weighs down on our young people, and majority of them live in the global south. And by the way, the statistics reveal something very interesting now, because if BBC did these massive surveys, it shows that the West is becoming more and more pessimistic over the last decade, whereas the global South, the rest of the world, is increasingly optimistic about the climate crisis, about productivity, about new technologies changing for the better. Not that they are naive about the futures, but because it's always relative to what their current tradition, the current constraints, the current, jobs that they don't have, and they don't want to be a farmer or a cleaner. They want to be a creator. So you see the boom of the creator economy, particularly from the global south. And that's why at the start I talked about the renaissance in the becoming, because young people feel finally, I have a tool that I can, use to my advantage, because the system is stacked against me. I can't change the state. I can't change the market. If I'm like, a lower income, person, maybe from a lower caste in India, I have a lot stacked against me. And yes, there is loneliness, but it's actually facilitating, relationships, because we are not being punished for being born into our situations, our contexts, our conditions that may not align with my aspirations and my desires of self-actualization.
I wonder, what's progress? How do we define progress? I'd love to hear from you guys on that.
Well, progress is, it's also one of those, just like civilization itself, which is a term that only emerged in the second half of the 18th century in the way we use it today. In the earlier part of the 18th century, it was an adverbial construction. Civilization was something that happened. And more specifically, it was the transformation of criminal to civil, something from criminal law to civil law, to make civilian, right? So it had nothing to do with civilization in the way that we think about it. Progress, too, is one of these terms. that, perhaps later in the 18th century, certainly by the 19th century, people start talking about progress. Often in a linear way. That doesn't mean that there are no collapses, because, of course, that's built into the idea of linear progression. And it becomes value, it has a value added to it, which is progress is good. Today, of course, in certain parts of the world, you can use progress as an insult. So to be a progressive is a really bad thing. And that itself is a fascinating phenomenon. They're all modern terms that we are using, right? Can we use them to get back to a pre-modern understanding of society? No.
Do we want to?
Do we want to? Probably that's an impossible thing to do anyway. I'm a historian, so I'm professionally dedicated to the past. But I think we are in a situation today where there's a plague of precedents. Everything that happens today, we think, oh, it's 1933, it's 1940, it's 1936. It's all of the precedents, without exception, are European or American. That alone tells you that they're delegitimized by definition, right?
But to be fair, a lot of the stuff that's happening is happening in the U.S. and Europe. So, I mean, that's not a surprise. I mean, if you talk about like something in Ukraine or in the U.K. or the U.S. electoral politics, wouldn't be out of place to use a European
Perhaps
precedent.
not, but even, say, if you think about the attack on the Congress, on the Capitol, right, at the end of Mr. Trump's first term, the narrative we had then was it was white nationalism, it was this, it was that, all of which is no doubt true. But when you actually look at that crowd, you see lots of Latinos. You have Indians with the Indian flag.
South Vietnam flag.
Yes,
Yeah.
you have Iranian royalists with
Yeah.
their flag. There are all kinds of people in there. And they were hospitably welcomed by the alleged, white nationalist, Confederate supporting crowd. So all of those things may be true at the same time. But, I would submit that focusing only on those bits of the movement that hark back to American history, the Civil War and all the rest, really ignores the global reality, even of that attack.
I think you touched on something interesting, which is, is there the sense within the global South that Western framings and Western narratives are being imposed upon very unique local issues?
I think that when we all paused about progress, it wasn't that we can't define it. It's more that we know that it is weighed down by a legacy of definitions and meanings, which signals that there's an epitome of culture and civilization, which is Anglo-Saxon in nature. It's a very post-colonial rubric that shaped a lot of the World War II institutions and their policies, which in some ways had devastating impact on, entire economies and countries. So this notion that the focus is just moving away from the tradition, the uncivilized, the primitive, which aka is the ex-colonies, and how do you shepherd them to the civilized, which happens to be, their past rulers. And so it smells so much of that term. And I do agree that we need to reclaim that in a sense that, and ask ourselves, like, yes, we want to move forward, right? And I think people are questioning this. And we talk about progress, like progress to what, right? And can we focus more on the to what than the journey of getting there?
So, Joseph, there's this discussion around progress and whether that's even the right way to frame whatever it is we're trying to aspire to. What are your thoughts?
Well, I said a few moments ago that I like to use terminology as precise and value neutral as possible, but now I'm going to go over to the other side.
Please.
In my role as a teacher, I teach a class in sustainability, and I ask, most of my students have ancestry from Northern Europe. I ask them, consider life in Northern Europe, let's say 400 years ago, what would it be like? And the answer is life expectancy would be about 40 years. A woman might have 5 to 7 children, of which 2 would live to adulthood, and the woman herself would be likely to die in childbirth. Be very little in the way of health care, 90% of the population would be farmers. The population as a whole would get very little in the way of what we consider education, even elementary education. And you consider that versus the way at least people in the wealthier countries live today, and I have no trouble calling that progress. And when I focus on sustainability, that is what I focus on, is the difference between then and now, for at least those of us who are fortunate enough to live to a first world standard of living.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's on at like that large a scale. I think it is I think it's a pretty good metric. I think that my only concern would be is that change possible? So certainly, I mean, if you look at life expectancy, I think the big jump, even in places, let's say like the US and the UK, which are kind of the first countries to industrialize, it wouldn't be till the 1870s, and certainly not, the 1870s or 1920s. So basically germ theory, and then you get public health and antibiotics, right? So I think that the challenge would be, if we think about this as progress, is does it work as a metric for progress if it's not universalizable to the whole human species?
Oh, yes.
So, I mean, I think that if one of the reasons I like this idea of life expectancy as a metric is that I think almost everybody, if someone said, "Would you like to live a longer life free of pain?" Right? We probably all say yes. I mean, I imagine most people would, right? So it's kind of an easy way to say that if you increase lifespan, decrease pain in that lifespan, that you have achieved progress in the broadest sense of the word. It's arguable that certainly the medical industry in the global West is, you can't have that development, you can't have progress in that field without consumerism. Like the consumer capitalist model is what drives the healthcare industry, is what drives the development of drugs, right? So can you have a non-consumer based, like consumerist society that is pursuing the kind of, as a system, as an entire system economically, is going to produce research that increases lifespan and decreases pain?
You bring up a great example. The U.S. system and healthcare. Mention any global south country that wants to be a U.S. Nobody. They want to be a Singapore. In fact, it's, they want to be, a way, like healthcare is too important to be a consumer.
Healthcare, but in the U.S. is really good if you have money.
No, but that's not a model that is aspirational for most of the world. In fact, if we look at healthcare or education or any of these essential institutions that enable us to self-actualize, they cannot be confined by capitalistic and consumerist terms alone.
But those are the societies that are developing the drugs and treatments.
No, India actually is
for sale in the West.
70% of generic drugs are produced in India. And by the way, that didn't even happen like a few decades ago, and now that's changed. And this also is very hopeful. Like India was importing grain, post-colonial time, and then it became one of the biggest exporters.
But are they developing the actual treatments and the drugs, or are they just producing the drugs once the patent is made or whatever?
When you think about who is developing, I'm just thinking about your conversation, who makes these people? Silicon Valley is driven by the world, actually. If they ban these H-1B visas, there goes American innovation. So when we talk about Americans driving innovation, it's actually the global South. It's like 2/3 of Silicon Valley are made by the world's majority. And so, the way I look at it,
they come to the U.S. Why?
Yes, but the U.S. at that point in time, right? But things are changing in the becoming, which is very much why we are here today. Is the U.S. in its current geopolitics serves as an extraordinary opportunity to push countries to rethink how they can keep their people, draw innovation back home, also produce, and it's happening. It's not in speculation stage alone. For example, India went ahead and built the largest digital public infrastructure in the world. Europe has been trying to do it for decades, and India went ahead and did it for a fraction of the cost, right? And now what is Europe doing? It's building something called the Euro stack, which is closely emulating the India stack. But, very little acknowledgement out there in mainstream media about the fact that there's a reverse flow of innovation happening from many parts of the world. And, the idea, if you look at what's happening in Silicon Valley, Elon Musk's vision of X for the future is to be WeChat, which is a decade old, right? Nobody seems to think this is ironic. And I can give 100 examples, like, the deep condescension about the majority world that is so baked into the American mindset right now is going to be their downfall in that respect. And I think it comes from that kind of perspective, to start with.
I want to go on the record and say I agree with her, just for the viewers.
Did you just agree with her now?
No,
or
I agree with
now
what she's saying in
was she
general.
so
Like,
compelling
I'm
that now you
I
agree
don't
with
want
her?
to come across as some like weird American nationalist or something. I'm just-
No.
As we close, Joseph, Payal spoke about what gives her hope. At the start of this conversation, you very much classified this moment in time as a tipping point. Did anything from this discussion give you hope?
I would actually like to close with a comment on AI, which keeps popping up in my life. I have been impressed with examples I've seen of it. It's so impressed that it's frightening. But I want to close with a comment, which is that the last thing the human population needs is another substitute for thinking.
Okay. Faisal, what gives you hope?
Well, as a historian, I have to say history gives me hope. I don't mean precedents from the past. I mean the realization that things change, inevitably change, and that you cannot predict what is to come in the future. This is actually something from a previous book I'd written on Gandhi, on Mahatma Gandhi, who was very much against historical thinking. So, of course, I was immediately attracted to him because he saw historical thinking as characteristic of imperialism, how you classify civilizations based on their pasts and their progress and all the rest. So India was backward, therefore it needed shepherding into the modern world. Right? And he thought, rightly, that history was not the only way in which we understand our world. He thought we could do so morally and indeed philosophically. And one way of doing so was by thinking philosophically about nonviolence as a project. One of his arguments was, let us actually focus on the present, not on the past, and not indeed on the future. So by living in the present like a child, children who live purely in the present, he thought you could actually, if you lived virtuously in that way, you could open up many more possibilities, because nonviolence in the present leads to nonviolence in the future. I don't know if I can live by that dictum, or indeed if it is entirely true, but it is one way in which you can think more openly about the future.
Okay. Root ourselves in the present. Jonathan, what gives you hope from this conversation?
I like what Faisal said.
Yeah? You want to just copy him?
I mean, it's the only thing that gives me hope. I mean, otherwise, I'm like extremely pessimistic. But what he says seems sensible.
All right. Thank you all so much for this really interesting discussion. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.